Clara woke up at 3 a.m. without knowing why, but the reason was in the window. The barn light was on again. She lay there watching it for a while, then got up, took the lantern from the table, and crossed the yard barefoot, the cold creeping up her legs with no shawl over her shoulders and no prepared words in her mind. Nate was sitting on the barn's doorstep, wearing his boots, awake, with his own lantern hanging from a nail beside his head. He did not seem startled to see Clara there in the dark, and it was that calmness that irritated her before anything else. "You're going to get sick walking barefoot on this frozen ground," Nate said, getting to his feet slowly. "This is neither the time nor the place. The one who should be sleeping is you," Clara replied, stopping 3 steps away from him. "And this isn't the first time. That light has stayed on until sunrise for 13 nights. 13. I counted every single one." "So did you," Nate repeated, and it was not a question. Clara did not answer. Nate took off his coat and placed it over her shoulders before she had time to refuse, then sat back down on the doorstep, far enough away that she could not return the coat without walking closer to him. "I didn't ask for that light," Clara said, her voice coming out harsher than she intended. "I didn't ask for the coat. I didn't ask for the gate to be repaired. I didn't ask for anything. I'm not the kind of woman who accepts what she didn't ask for, cowboy, because everything I was ever given for free in this life came with a bill at the end. So put out that lantern and go to sleep. Tomorrow there's work to do." "I'm not putting it out," Nate replied, as calm as ever. Clara felt her face grow warm, and it wasn't from anger. "Why not?" she asked. "Because you didn't cross this yard in the middle of the night, in the freezing cold, barefoot and without a shawl, because of a lantern," Nate said. He spoke without raising his voice, looking up at her from the doorstep, his hat resting on his knees. "I'll tell you what I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. You woke up, looked out the window, and saw the light. If it had been out, you still would have gotten up, put on your boots, walked all the way over here, and knocked on this door to see if my horse was still in the corral. The light being on saves you that trouble. That's all it's for. As long as it's lit, you know I'm still here, and you can sleep peacefully." Clara stood there on the frozen mud, with a stranger's coat over her shoulders and the unlit lantern in her hand, without a single word to say. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Every man she had known either wanted something from her or wanted something from her land, and they all spoke beautifully to get it. That man was asking for nothing. He was simply saying, plainly and directly, something that she herself had never had the courage to admit in front of the mirror. "Put it out," Clara said. And this time her voice carried no strength at all. "If I put it out, will you be able to sleep?" Nate asked. Clara opened her mouth and did not answer, because the honest answer would reveal everything, and if she lied, he would not believe her. "That's what I thought," Nate said. She went back to the house without saying goodnight, lay down with his coat draped over the chair, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. It wasn't the light that bothered her. It was what she felt for that man. Dear listeners, before we continue, I would like to know what country you are listening from today. My name is Jocelyn Santos, the original creator of this script. The stories I create are exclusive for broadcast on the Boundless Ranch Love channel, because they are my own work, and I do not authorize copies or copyright registrations by third parties. It means a great deal to me to know how far this voice is reaching. And if this story is keeping you company right now, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Clara Whitlock was 27 years old and owned Cedar Hollow, a ranch nestled between 2 mountains in the Little Fawn Valley, in the Wyoming Territory, in the autumn of 1881. The land had belonged to her family for more than 3 decades. 2 winters earlier, fever entered that house and never left. It took old Whitlock within a week, took her mother a few weeks later, and Clara buried them both beneath the same tree, east of the house only a few days apart. 3 things remained to her. A 19-year-old brother named Samuel, a ranch she managed from sunrise to sunset, and a debt her father had signed at the Hollis Bend land office, one that grew every month without anyone touching it. What did not remain, and what Clara had stopped expecting, was someone awake inside that house when she closed the door at the end of the day. Josiah Vance was the one who taught her how the world worked, and he taught her for free. The 2 had been promised to each other since spring. He came to the funeral, held her hand in front of the entire town, and said, in that pleasant voice of his, that she would not face any of it alone. The ranch's debt appeared in the bank's records at the end of the summer. Josiah's letter arrived 3 weeks later, half a page, beautiful handwriting, saying the timing was not good and that he was very sorry. Clara needed no one to connect the two dates. She did it herself, sitting at the kitchen table, the paper in her hand, and the empty house around her. And that day she learned the only lesson she still carried. A man looks at a woman and does the math. When the numbers don't add up, he writes a beautiful letter and leaves. She cried that night until she had no tears left, and she never cried about it again. The land office carriage came through the gate on a Tuesday morning, and Silas Merrick climbed down, brushing the dust from his sleeve with 2 light pats, making it clear that he did not like setting foot on ranch land. Clara waited for him on the porch, standing, because she was not going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her seated. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitlock," Merrick said, removing his hat with a politeness that never reached his eyes. "I've brought the notice of maturity. 90 days starting today, and after that the matter leaves my hands and goes to the company." "Leave it with me," Clara said, holding out her hand for the paper. "You'll want to read it carefully," Merrick continued, still not handing over the document. "And you'll want to think wisely. The company has been very patient with this property, far more patient than it would have been with any other. But office patience has an expiration date, and yours is running out." "I've read enough office papers to know what that word means when it comes from your mouth," Clara replied, taking the paper from his fingers without waiting for permission. Merrick smiled with half his mouth and held out the pen. Clara signed the receipt against the porch railing, her handwriting steady, without a single trembling line, and handed the pen back. He slipped the paper into his vest pocket, let his eyes wander over the barn roof and the fallen north fence, then lingered a moment longer on her face, searching for a fear that was not there. "It's good land," Merrick remarked. "But poorly cared for, it hurts just to look at it." "Then you can look the other way," Clara said. "The road to the gate is the same one that brought you here." He laughed, climbed back into the carriage, and left. Clara remained on the porch until the dust settled on the road, and only then did she unclench her hand, which had been tightly closed the whole time, and see the marks her fingernails had left in her palm. Ellen Rusk arrived in the middle of the afternoon carrying a loaf of bread and the frankness of someone who had lived on the other side of the fence since before Clara was born. She sat in the kitchen, listened to the entire story about the notice without interrupting, and only spoke when Clara mentioned that she had seen Josiah Vance on the town's main street, and that he had turned his face away. "That man didn't give up because he stopped loving you," Ellen said, setting down her cup. "I'll speak plainly, because no one in this town has the courage. Josiah gave up because he has no character. He wanted you while your father was alive and the land was free and clear. The day the debt appeared, he did the math and disappeared, and then had the nerve to write a beautiful letter so he could sleep peacefully. One day this whole town will understand that the Whitlock girl lost nothing that day. He was the one who lost." "I don't want to talk about that, Ellen," Clara said. "I know you don't," Ellen replied. "That's exactly why I'm the one saying it." The cowboy appeared at the gate of Cedar Hollow the following day, with the sun high overhead, on foot, leading his horse by the reins and with road dust up to his knees. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and strong, wearing worn work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low until it almost hid his eyes. He stopped outside the gate and waited, and that was the first thing Clara noticed, because a man looking for work usually walked in first and asked questions afterward. "Are you lost?" Clara asked from the middle of the yard. "I'm looking for work, ma'am," he replied. "Then you really are lost," Clara said, walking to the gate. "I'll be honest with you because I don't like wasting anyone's time. This ranch can't afford to pay a cowboy. I have a fallen fence, a well that's filling with sand, and 90 days before I lose all of this. That's what I have to offer, and none of it turns into wages at the end of the month." "I didn't ask about wages," he said. Clara looked at that man carefully for the first time. She also looked at his horse, an animal far too good for someone in that condition from the road, well cared for, with clean hooves and a brushed coat, and kept that observation to herself without saying a word. "What is your name, cowboy?" she asked. "Nate," he replied. "Nate what?" "Just Nate is enough," he said. "I'm asking for a bed in the barn and food for 2 weeks, and I'll do whatever work you tell me to do. However you tell me to do it." If, at the end of those 2 weeks, you think it wasn't worth it, I'll saddle up, continue on my way, and you won't owe me a thing. Not even a word." "Everyone wants something," Clara said, staring at him. "And what do you want?" Nate took a moment to answer. It was only a brief pause, but Clara noticed it, and she would remember it many times afterward. 2 weeks, Nate said. Ellen, who had been standing at the corner of the porch with her arms crossed the entire time, looked at the man, looked at the horse, and then looked at Clara, narrowing her eyes in the way of someone who had noticed something and intended to save it for later. Clara opened the gate. It was a gesture that lasted 5 seconds, and she spent the rest of her life understanding the magnitude of what she had done in that moment. That first night, she set the table and stopped with the third plate in her hand. For 2 years, that table had held only 2 plates and nothing more. She stood there looking at the dishes longer than necessary, then placed the plate at the end, in the seat that had belonged to her father, and called the man to dinner. Nate came in with his hat in his hand, thanked her, sat down, ate everything on his plate, praised the food, and went out to the barn without saying 4 sentences. Samuel went to bed. Clara washed the dishes alone, and when she reached the third plate, she held it under the hot water for a long time without washing anything. In the barn, lying on the straw mattress, Nate waited for the house to extinguish its lanterns one by one. Then he took the leather folder out of his luggage and opened it to the page the Fairhaven office had typed before the trip. It was the list of the properties that Barlow Land and Cattle Company was going to seize in that valley as soon as the deadline expired. Cedar Hollow was on the 7th line, written out in full, with the due date beside it. Nathaniel Barlow read the ranch's name 3 times, and with each reading his mouth grew drier. He had come to the valley to see with his own eyes the lands he was going to seize, and what he found was a woman who had signed her own eviction that very morning, without shedding a single tear, and who, even so, had set a third plate at the table for a stranger who had no way to pay for it. He looked through the open barn door at the last lit window of the house and felt a shame he had not felt since he was a boy. He closed the folder and hid it beneath everything else, in the most concealed place in his luggage. Then he lit the lantern, hung it on the nail by the door, and left the light facing her window all night long. If someone had asked him the reason that first night, he would not have known how to answer. On the second morning, Clara woke up at 4:30, and the corral gate had already been repaired. She stood on the porch with her mug in her hand, looking at it without fully understanding what she was feeling. That gate had been dragging on the ground since the winter of the fever. She had asked her father to repair it while he was still alive, then asked Samuel, and one day she stopped asking and started lifting the gate with her knee every time she needed to pass through. Someone had fixed it in the dark, before sunrise, without saying a word and without asking for anything in return. That was how the entire 2 weeks went. Nate never asked what needed to be done. He looked, found it, and fixed it. The loose board on the third step, the barn hinge, the trough that leaked and sent the cattle into the wrong side of the pasture. They were all small things, and they were all things Clara had handled with a scowl ever since she had been left alone. Seeing them taken care of without having asked stirred something inside her that made her angry with herself. And every night, when she put out the kitchen lantern and went to bed, the barn light was on. The first night she thought it was normal, because a man in a strange place never sleeps well. On the third, she woke in the middle of the night, went to get a drink of water, and the light was still there. On the 5th, she stood at her bedroom window waiting for that light to go out, and it never did. On the 7th night, Clara called her brother into the kitchen and asked, "Doesn't the cowboy sleep?" Clara asked. "I don't know," Samuel replied with a shrug. "I offered to trade nights with him, since he stays awake for no reason. I told him I'd keep an eye on the cattle while he got some rest." "And what did he say?" "He said he wasn't watching the cattle," Samuel replied, "and he didn't say anything else." Clara kept that sentence in her mind for an entire week. The worst part was that she was no longer the same, and it was the little things that gave her away. She began looking toward the gate about 4 times a day, just to see where he was coming from. She started spending more time on her hair in the mornings, and lied to herself about the reason. One Wednesday, a cow lay down to give birth beside the old fence, in the worst spot in the pasture, and the 2 of them stayed there in the grass until almost dark. By the end, they were sitting on the ground, dirty up to their elbows, watching the calf try to stand for the 3rd time, and Nate laughed. It was a short laugh, the kind from someone who wasn't used to laughing, and Clara quickly turned her face away so she wouldn't be caught watching him. She counted the nights. On the 13th, she could not bear it any longer, crossed the yard barefoot, and told him to put out the light. What she heard in return was that the light existed, so she would know he was still there. She went back to the house with his coat over her shoulders and did not sleep at all. The coat remained hanging behind the kitchen door for 2 days, and neither of them said a word about it. On the 3rd day, Clara washed the coat, let it dry on the clothesline, and hung it on the nail in the barn beside the lantern without handing it to him directly. The following day, Nate was working with the coat on, and he did not thank her, and she stood watching him from the porch longer than she should have. That night, Clara did not put out the kitchen lantern. She made no decision and thought about nothing. She simply stood looking at the barn light through the window, her hand resting on the lantern switch, and did not put it out. She slept with the house lit for the first time in 2 years, and when she woke up, the barn light was still there. That was when she realized he had spent the entire night watching her window the same way she had been watching his door. It became their habit, without a single word being agreed upon. Every night, 2 lights burning on opposite sides of a dark yard, and neither of them put theirs out first. The 2 weeks ended on a Thursday. Clara woke up and worked all day knowing the date. She repaired the water pump with him that afternoon, handed the wrench into his hand, brushed her fingers against his by accident, and let them linger longer than necessary. Nate talked about the coming winter, the corral, the things that still needed to be done on that land, and she listened and nodded, and neither of them said the only sentence that mattered, which was that his time would be over when the sun went down. At dinner, she set out the 3rd plate as usual. Samuel ate quickly, talked about the new calf, and left. Nate thanked her for the meal and stood up to go. "Today makes 2 weeks," Clara said. Nate stopped with his hat in his hand. "Yes, it has been 2 weeks," he replied. "You were very clear at my gate," she continued, standing on the other side of the table. 2 weeks of a bed and food, and if I thought it hadn't been worth it, you would saddle up and leave without owing me anything. The sun went down an hour ago. Your time is up." "I know the date, Mrs. Whitlock," Nate said. "I counted the days the same way you counted the nights." That caught Clara off guard, and she needed a moment to keep her expression under control. "So?" she asked. "What are you going to do?" "That's for you to tell me," Nate replied. She placed both hands on the table and spoke all at once, because she knew she would never manage to say it little by little. "I asked once in my life, cowboy, just once. On the day my father and mother were buried beneath that tree out there, I asked a man not to leave, and he left me standing at that door with my hand held out like a beggar, and 3 weeks later he sent me a letter in beautiful handwriting so he could sleep peacefully. I learned my lesson. I may want something, but I don't ask anymore, not even if the earth falls apart. So don't stand there looking at me waiting for me to ask, because it won't happen." Nate stood still. Then he pulled out the chair, sat back down, and placed his hat on the table. Clara had not expected that. "I'm not waiting for you to ask for anything," he said, his voice carrying the same calm tone as always. "Then I'll speak first, so you won't have to. I'm not getting on my horse today. Not tomorrow, nor the day after. And it's not because of the barn or the food or the work that's still left to finish. You know very well why, and so do I, and neither of us has the courage to say it out loud. But I'm not going anywhere. I'll stay until you tell me to leave. And on the day you do, I'll saddle up and go without arguing." The ground seemed to disappear beneath Clara's feet. She had spent 2 weeks defending her home from a man who had never attacked anything, and there he was, sitting at her table, saying all of that with his hands resting open on the wood, making no promises and running from nothing. "You don't know anything about me," she said, and her voice broke halfway through. He stood up, picked up his hat, and walked over to Clara, gently tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear. "I know you don't sleep," Nate replied, looking into her eyes. "And I know why, because I feel the same." And before he could do anything that might frighten her, he thanked her for the meal once more and went out to the barn. He did not saddle up, and he did not leave. Clara remained standing in the same place until her heart slowed down, and that night she slept better than she had since her father's funeral. Samuel brought the mail from town on Monday and handed Nate a letter in the corral. Clara saw the scene from the kitchen window. Nate read that letter twice, and his hand slowly closed around the paper. That night she stood at the window watching the barn light, just as she did every night. She saw him sitting on the doorstep with the envelope in his hand. She watched him open it and read it again. Then she saw him lift the lantern's glass, hold the paper to the flame, and keep holding it as the fire climbed, until the flames reached his fingers. Nate dropped what remained onto the dirt floor and crushed it under his boot until nothing was left. Clara stood at the dark window for a long time, her cold hand resting against the glass and her heart beating unevenly. Because Nate had burned a letter. And that night, for the first time since the dawn when she had crossed the yard barefoot, she put out the kitchen lantern before he put out his. The rain arrived at the end of the following week, in the middle of the afternoon, and it came all at once. The two of them were at the north fence, far from the house, and the only thing nearby was the old cabin on the property line, the one Clara's father had built when she was a little girl and that no one used anymore. They went inside soaking wet. Nate lit the iron stove that was still there with the firewood he found in the cabin. The rain pounded hard against the roof, and the entire world disappeared outside. Clara sat on the floor near the fire, her back against the wall and her arms wrapped around her knees, shivering from the cold and trying to hide what she was feeling. Nate noticed. He took off his wet coat, shook it once, and placed it over her shoulders without asking permission, just as he had on the night in the yard. This time she did not complain, and it was the first thing he had ever given her that she accepted without saying a word. "My father built this cabin the year I was born," Clara said, staring into the fire. "He slept here during branding season so he wouldn't waste time going back and forth. I used to sneak after him, and my mother would scold me until the next day." "You talk about your father all the time," Nate said, sitting against the opposite wall, close enough that their legs almost touched. "About your mother, about Samuel, even about that Josiah, whenever you get angry." "So what?" Clara asked. "Nothing," he replied. "Nothing," she insisted, turning to look at him. "I've noticed it for days, and I'm going to say it once and for all. I tell you my whole life, and you tell me nothing. No father, no mother, no hometown, no last name. A man falls out of the sky at my gate, sleeps in my barn, stays awake all night because of me, and I don't even know where he came from. If you're a wanted man, I'd rather know today." Nate stared into the fire for a long time. Clara watched him open his mouth and then give up, and what appeared on that man's face at that moment was not deceit. It was fear. She had never seen fear on that face before, and his fear frightened her more than any answer. "Do you really want to know?" Nate asked. "I do." "Then I ask one thing," he said, his voice low and lacking all firmness, for the first time since the day at the gate. "Ask me again in a month. If you still want to know, I'll tell you everything, from beginning to end, and I promise I won't hide anything. You have my word." "Why not today?" Clara asked. "Because today, you still let me sleep in your barn," Nate replied. Clara should have stood up. She should have opened the door and gone back out into the rain. Instead, she stayed sitting there on the floor, with his coat over her shoulders and her knee pressed against his, listening to the rain on the roof, and asked nothing more. They remained that way until the rain stopped, and it was the closest thing to a request that happened that autumn, and neither of them touched the other with so much as a finger. They returned in the dark. In the kitchen, she lit the stove and put the kettle on, while he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, dripping water onto her floor, making as if to leave so he wouldn't dirty the house. "Come in and sit down, Nate," Clara said. He stopped. It was the first time she had said his name, and they both realized it at the same instant. Nate sat in the chair beside the stove without taking his eyes off her. "Have a drink first," he said. "You spent the whole afternoon out in the rain." "I'm used to it," Clara replied. "No one gets used to that," Nate said. "They just endure it, and that's something entirely different." She placed the mug in his hand. Their fingers touched against the hot metal, and she did not pull her hand away in any hurry. In that kitchen, that night, the formal titles were left behind, and neither of them spoke about it, just as they never spoke about the light. When Clara stepped down from the carriage in front of the barn, Nate was waiting with his hat in his hand, and his face did something he never allowed it to do. "You," he began, then stopped. "Lost your voice, cowboy?" Clara asked. "I did," Nate admitted, "and I'm not ashamed to say it." That night they danced. Clara had not danced since the spring before the fever, and his hands were steady and gentle. The whole town watched them, and for the first time in 2 years, she did not care about the town. In the middle of the third song, Nate stopped dancing without letting go of her hand. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he had called her by name. "I need to tell you something, and I don't want to wait another month." "You can tell me, Nate," she said, and her heart was pounding in her throat. And it was at that exact moment that the barn door opened. The woman who entered was not from the valley. She wore wine-colored silk, gloves that reached her elbows, and the dust from the road had not touched her. She stopped at the entrance, swept her eyes across the entire hall with the patience of someone searching for only one thing, and the music gradually faded. Josiah Vance, leaning against the back wall, straightened his posture. Merrick, standing beside the pie table, smiled with half his mouth. The woman crossed the hall and stopped in front of them. "Nathaniel," she said. Clara felt Nate's hand turn cold inside hers. "Adeline," he replied. 3 months, Nathaniel," the woman continued, speaking loudly, in the manner of someone who wanted the entire barn to hear. 3 months without a letter, without a telegram, without a single word to your father. The office in Fairhaven is in complete chaos, and I cross half the territory to find the owner of Barlow Land and Cattle Company dressed as a ranch hand, dancing in a barn, holding hands with one of his own company's debtors. She looked Clara up and down without any hurry. "Oh, so you don't know. My apologies. My name is Adeline Thorne, and I am his fiancée, and this man came to the valley to evaluate with his own eyes the lands the company will seize when the deadline expires. Yours included, my dear. 7th line on the list he carries. I read it." No one in the barn breathed. Clara let go of Nate's hand the way someone lets go of something burning hot. "Clara," Nate said. "Listen, none of this is the way she's saying it." "Don't call me that," Clara replied. It was her voice that frightened the town, because it carried no shout. It was the same voice she used with Merrick. "I'm going to do some arithmetic out loud, if you'll all excuse me," Clara said, speaking to him while looking him straight in the eyes. "You arrived at my gate the day after I received my notice of default. I asked you once what you wanted, and you took your time answering. Now I know why you hesitated." Her voice broke only once, and she steadied it. "For 2 years I kept telling myself that men look at a woman and do the math. One single man made me doubt that. It was you, the worst of them all, because the others at least had the decency to do the math in front of me." "Clara, I was going to tell you today," Nate said. "I was going to tell you right now during this dance." "You were," Clara repeated. "After all this time, after the coat, after the cabin, after hearing my name from your lips. You were going to tell me today." She picked up the shawl from the chair. "You weren't going to tell me anything. You were going to get caught, and you did." She walked out of the barn on foot, wearing her taffeta dress, and no one had the courage to follow her. No one except Samuel, who picked up his hat, crossed the hall, and stopped in front of the man he had spent the entire autumn admiring. "Pack your things today," Samuel said, and the 19-year-old spoke with his father's voice. "Before my sister gets home." And at the barn door, with Adeline Thorne's carriage still kicking up dust on the road, Silas Merrick stood waiting with a new document in his hand, and a smile he made no effort whatsoever to hide. Nathaniel Barlow left the dance after Clara, and had not taken 10 steps before Silas Merrick was standing at the barn door waiting for him, the document already unfolded in his hand and his hat on his head. "Mr. Barlow," Merrick said, pronouncing the last name loudly, with satisfaction, for the entire street to hear. "How fortunate for me. I saved myself a trip to Fairhaven. This is the execution order for Cedar Hollow, drafted this week. All that's missing is the signature of the company's owner, and the company's owner, it seems, has been in the valley for a month." Nathaniel looked at the document. Half the town had come out of the barn after the commotion, and was standing there in the dust, watching the 2 men. Josiah Vance stood among them with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who had finally understood why he had been replaced. "Put that away," Nathaniel said. "I will," Merrick replied, folding the document slowly. "But a deadline is a deadline, and it runs with or without your signature. It was a pleasure working for you this autumn. I hope you liked what you saw." He walked away smiling, and Nathaniel remained standing in the middle of the street with the entire town watching him, and never in his life had he felt so small. He returned to Cedar Hollow after midnight to collect his belongings, because there was nothing else left for him to collect there. Clara did not appear. He saw the light in her bedroom go out as soon as his horse came through the gate, and he understood the message. He packed his bag in the darkness of the barn, taking his things off the nail one by one, and the last thing he took down was the coat, the one she had washed and hung there without placing it directly into his hands. Samuel appeared at the door with the lantern. "I spent the entire autumn following you around," the young man said, his voice hard, though he could not quite bring himself to look at him. "I kept telling my sister you were the only decent man who had ever set foot on this land." "I'm sorry," Nathaniel replied. "Then why did you lie?" Nathaniel stopped with the backpack in his hand. "Because I was a coward," he said. "There isn't a better answer, and I looked for one all night." Samuel did not reply. He stood there holding the lantern until the horse passed through the gate, and then remained there a while longer, in the darkness, not knowing what to do with all of it. In his room at the Hollis Bend Hotel, Nathaniel did not sleep. He spent the night replaying every word Clara had spoken in the barn and realizing he had no answer for any of them. She was right about everything. It was useless to explain that the shame had begun on the very first night. None of it changed one single fact, which was that she had learned the truth from someone else's mouth. Adeline Thorne found him in the hotel parlor at dawn, dressed for a ballroom that did not exist in that valley. "There is no engagement, Adeline, and you know it," he said, before she could speak. "That was an arrangement between your father and mine, made across an office desk. I never gave my word to anyone." "I know," she admitted, smiling with something almost like pity, which was even worse. "And I'll tell you something else you already know. That woman will never believe another word you say for as long as she lives. You can solve every one of her problems, and she'll still look at you and see the man who stayed silent for 13 nights. At least I was honest about what I wanted." She left before noon, and it was the truest thing Adeline Thorne had ever said in her life. Silas Merrick opened the land office at 8 o'clock. At 5 minutes past 8, the owner of the company was standing on the other side of the counter, no longer dressed as a ranch hand. Nathaniel paid off Cedar Hollow's debt with his own money, from the first interest charge to the last, and had a clean deed drawn up in Clara Whitlock's name alone. It took 2 hours and the signatures of 3 men, and when he walked out with the folded document in his pocket, he felt for the first time in a week that he was doing something right. It was the greatest mistake of his life. Clara was standing on the porch when he dismounted. She did not come down the steps or move any closer. "I came to bring you this before I leave," Nathaniel said, holding out the document. "The debt has been paid. The deed is in your name, Mrs. Whitlock. There is no more deadline, no more company watching this land. It's over." Clara looked at the document in his hand and did not reach out. "Let me tell you everything first," he continued, his voice breaking. "My name is Nathaniel Barlow. The company belongs to my father and me, and I came to the valley to see with my own eyes the lands that would become ours. I introduced myself as a ranch hand because no owner ever shows the truth about a property when they know who I am. On the first night, I read your ranch's name on my list and felt ashamed. On the second morning, I repaired your gate, and from that moment on, I was no longer a man evaluating land. I didn't tell you because I was afraid. Afraid of exactly what's happening now." Clara listened with her arms crossed, without interrupting. And when he finished, she spoke quietly and slowly. "I told you in my kitchen that a man looks at a woman and does the math," Clara said. "And today you took the only thing I still had left, which was my right to lose my ranch with my head held high, and turned it into another debt. And now you're holding out the change to me." "It's not change," Nathaniel said. "It's the least a man can do after he's made a mistake. Josiah left when he did the math and realized there would be no profit in me. He sent me a beautiful letter so he could sleep peacefully. You lied and then signed a document so you could sleep peacefully. Both of you sleep peacefully, and I'm the only one who stays awake." She stepped down one step. "Keep your deed. I'd rather sign my own eviction in front of Merrick than owe my home to the man who ate at my table while lying to me. He stood there with the document held out in his hand for so long that the entire town would have found it ridiculous. Then he placed the deed on the porch railing, settled his hat on his head, and mounted his horse. Clara did not look at him. Before we continue, a brief notice. This is an original story created by Jocelyn Santos on July 15, 2026. All rights reserved. Registration of rights by third parties is prohibited, as is reproduction or use on other channels without the author's prior written authorization. Ellen Rusk arrived late that afternoon, and she did not come carrying a loaf of bread this time. She found the deed still resting on the porch railing, damp with the night air, and Clara sitting in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a cold mug. "I'm going to say what I came to say and then leave," Ellen warned, pulling out a chair. "The town is saying you were bought by a rich man, and they'll keep saying it for 2 years until they find something else to talk about. That's the least important part." "Then tell me what the most important part is," Clara said. "The most important part is this," Ellen replied. "Josiah abandoned you, but the cowboy came and stayed. He arrived on the day this land wasn't worth a thing to anyone, with a debt bigger than the herd, knocked on your gate, and asked to work for free." Ellen tapped the table once with her finger. "I'm not saying he did the right thing. He lied, and lies hurt, and you have every right to be hurt. But I've lived 60 years, and I'm going to teach you something. Some men deceive us to take something from us, and that one didn't take a thing. That one gave something back. He stayed silent because he was afraid of losing you." Clara did not answer. "Answer me one thing," Ellen continued, getting to her feet. "All that time, did he ever ask you for anything?" Clara stared at the cold mug. "He asked for the 2 weeks," she replied. "And what did he do with those 2 weeks?" Ellen asked. Clara could not answer, and Ellen did not press her. The old woman picked up her shawl, walked to the door, and spoke one last time without turning around. "That deed is still outside getting soaked by the night air," Ellen said. "It'll be the most valuable thing that ever rotted away on a porch railing in this valley." Clara spent the night awake, and it was not for the usual reason. Now there was no light at all in the barn. The yard was black again, the way it had been for 2 years, and that darkness was heavier than she remembered. She got up 3 times, looked out the window and saw the same thing. Nothing. In the morning, she stepped onto the porch, and the deed was still there, soaked through, with the ink blurred around the edges, and her name still legible in the center. Clara picked up the document and stood there holding it, looking at the gate he had repaired before sunrise, now standing open. Clara kept that deed on the kitchen table for 3 days, without putting it away, and without tearing it up. She worked from dawn until dark on all 3 days, and on all 3 days Ellen's question came back to her. It wasn't the question about the lie. It was the other one. And what did he do with those 2 weeks? She knew the answer. On the 3rd night, Clara stood at the window looking at the dark yard and spoke aloud, alone, in the middle of her own kitchen. "If I let that man leave because of my pride, then I'll be the one at fault," she said, "and then I'll be just like Josiah, who also thought he was doing the right thing." The next morning, she woke Samuel before sunrise. "Saddle my horse," Clara said. "Where are you going?" the young man asked. "To get back what belongs to me," she replied. Nathaniel Barlow was at the Hollis Bend train station, his suitcase on the ground, and his horse already loaded, waiting for the 8 o'clock train to Fairhaven. He had no reason left to remain in that valley, and the only thing he still intended to do was dismiss Silas Merrick as soon as he reached the office, which he did 3 days later. Clara dismounted in the middle of the street and crossed the entire platform with the town watching, just as they had watched her at the dance. She stopped in front of him and held out the deed. "Take this back," she said. "Clara." "Take it," she repeated. "I don't want my home for free. I've never wanted anything from any man for free, and I'm not about to start today." Nathaniel took the document and his hand trembled, and he did not hide it from her. "Then I have nothing left to offer you," he said. "Yes, you do," Clara replied. She took a breath and said it all at once, loudly enough for the telegraph operator to hear and repeat later. "I'm returning your offer, word for word. Only this time I want your full name before I open the gate." Nate stood there looking at that woman in the middle of the platform and took a long time before he could speak. "Nathaniel Barlow," he said, 32 years old. "My father is getting old, and the company will soon be mine. I've spent my entire life being judged for what I have. One woman agreed to marry me without loving me, in an office arrangement I never signed. That's why I came as a ranch hand. It wasn't to deceive you. It was to find out whether there was any place in the world where someone would look at me and not see my last name." He tightened his grip on the deed. "I found that place on your ranch, and then I became afraid of losing you. But I lost you anyway." "You were afraid of being loved because of the company," Clara said. "I was. And I was afraid of being loved because of the land," she replied. "The two of us spent the entire autumn afraid of the same thing." The train whistle sounded around the bend. No one on the platform moved. "The gate is open," Clara said. Nathaniel Barlow picked up his suitcase from the station platform. The 2 weeks came to an end, and this time no one counted the days. He proposed one November afternoon on the porch, with the sun setting behind the mountains and Clara sitting on the step with a mug in her hand. "I want to light the barn lantern one last time today," Nathaniel said. Clara looked at him. "Why?" she asked. "Because starting tomorrow, if you'll have me, I'll be sleeping inside this house," he replied. "Then you won't have to look out the window in the middle of the night to know I'm still here. You'll only have to turn your head." He removed his hat. "Will you marry me, Clara?" She set the mug down on the step, stood up, and walked over to him for the first time, without either of them needing any excuse. "It had been yes for a long time," she said. "I was only waiting for your courage to arrive." They were married in the wooden church of Hollis Bend on a Saturday morning. Samuel gave his sister away with his father's voice and trembling hands. 1 year later, Cedar Hollow had new fencing along every boundary, 100 more head of cattle in the lower pasture, and 2 names in the account book. Samuel handled the branding on his own, and no one in the valley called the young man a boy anymore. The deed remained framed on the kitchen wall, with the ink blurred around the edges from the night air of that night, because Clara insisted on it. She said it was there to remind them of the 2 stubborn people who had almost thrown everything away. And the barn lantern was never lit again. It remained hanging from the nail by the door, with its flame extinguished and its glass clean, because Nathaniel never allowed anyone to remove it. On winter nights, when darkness settled over the valley early, the Cedar Hollow house had only 1 light burning, in the kitchen, with 2 mugs on the table and 2 pairs of boots by the door. And Clara Whitlock, who had spent 2 years looking across a dark yard before going to sleep, no longer needed to look out any window. Dear listeners of Boundless Ranch Love, we have reached the end of another story, and before I go, I'd like to invite you to think about something. Have you ever noticed how life teaches us to do the math? We learn the hard way to add up those who stayed, subtract those who left, and coldly calculate what went wrong. Today's character learned that in the worst possible way, and with good reason. But there is one thing life's mathematics cannot explain, and that is doing good from the heart. Setting 1 more plate on the table when money is tight, or staying awake until someone else can sleep peacefully. That doesn't pay the bills or earn interest, but it is what changes someone's world. Being kind is never a loss, because kindness always finds its way back. And before we close, I want to tell you something from the heart. No one is ever too old to be loved. We are the ones who convince ourselves of that. We make excuses, call it wisdom, and slowly extinguish our own light until we become accustomed to the darkness. Don't do that. Leave at least 1 little light burning somewhere. Love takes time, sometimes a very long time, but it knows how to walk through the dark, and it always finds those who have the courage to keep their hearts open. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. And if you still haven't subscribed to the Boundless Ranch Love channel, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. There are so many stories I want to share with you. A big hug, and until next time.